I have short videos about both of them. Henri Cartier-Bresson, we're going to take a look at right now. Diane Arbus, I'm going to spend more time on, not just today, but as we go forward into street photo. Both of these people are sort of the beginning of street photo. And, you know, if you want to watch these over again on your own, that'd be great. Let me pull them up here. As I talk about them, what I want you to understand, especially with the street photo assignment, is that I find street photography to be one of the most difficult things to do. And how you define street photo is sort of up to you. But basically for me, it's carrying your camera around, going out and finding something to photograph. Not starting with an idea of your own, but going out and trying to find something to photograph. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I much prefer to, why is this taking so long? I much prefer to come up with an idea and then to go out and make an image of that. Or, you know, when I work for a client, I'm told this is what I'm photographing, make it interesting. Okay, those are easier for me than going out with my camera and just trying to find something to photograph. And I think for most people, it is as well, because what happens when I tell people to go do this, I usually end up with a lot of photos of their shoes and things like that, their car, because you just photograph the things that you like around you. Street photo is a little different, but I'll spend more time on that as we go forward. Hopefully this video will play right now. I don't even know what that icon is doing because it doesn't seem to be loading. Let me try this again. Who's using up all my bandwidth?
Hey, photographer, have you ever been in a place like this where you're walking around with your camera, looking
perfectly? And this is just...
Okay, so now this is about Henri Cartier-Bresson. What?
How do you know when to press the shutter of your camera? How do you know when you need to take a photograph? How do you decide that this is the moment, this is it, I just have to take a photo? That is what the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson was calling the decisive moment. That moment of perfect position of the person that is being photographed.
So, Cartier-Bresson, very important that you understand that he is responsible for this thing called the decisive moment. That moment that you hit the shutter release on your camera, that moment that you choose. So light rays are constantly coming through your lens. They don't record on the sensor until you hit that shutter release. And then all that records is that fraction of a second that you choose to open that shutter. That is what he referred to as the decisive moment. How do you know when is the perfect time to do that? And that sums up photo. What is that fraction of a second?
To the perfect position of the photographer that takes the photo. It all has to come together perfectly. And this is just a click, a moment, split of a second.
So I want you to take a look at these images. We'll come back and look at them. But, you know, again, I said street photography is one of the most difficult because it's about, you know, and I tend to really dislike photos of homeless people or people on the street. They just feel exploitive to me for the most part. They're easy to shoot. You know, there's always people passed out on the street or living in tents or whatever. And, you know, I never know what you're trying to do with those by simply showing me. The juxtaposition here, you know, of a woman looking at this guy, again, that makes what makes this image a little bit more interesting. You know, is this sympathy? Is this disgust in her face? You know, relates to something larger. Sometimes I feel like people photograph homeless people simply to make themselves feel better or as oddities. When we look at Diane Arbus, which I should tell you, I assume you're all adults. We will be seeing images that may contain nudity or controversial subject matter. If they do, you but, you know, I'll talk a little bit more about her approach to photography as well. Much more controversial, even especially at the time, less so now, but we'll talk about that.
Henri Cartier-Bresson was a French photographer born in 1908. He is considered to be the master of candid photography, and he was one of the founding members of Magnum Photos. But what he's famous for is this concept of decisive moment that produces a lovely candid photo. Candid photography is one created without creating a posed appearance. It doesn't matter if the subject that is being photographed is aware.
So this is just a great photograph. I mean, one, because this mannequin seems to be looking at them and they're not looking at the mannequins, which, you know, the sort of reversal, it's sort of a visual pun, but also just the way she's holding her hand, and, you know, that the mannequins are based on real people, but are real people based, you know, this back and forth between the two, you know, even their connection, her looking this way, you know, longingly, you know, her looking longingly, this one not paying attention to whatever she is, you know, that is just a good photo. And street photo, that's the hard part, is being in the right place at the right time to take that photograph. Now, sometimes, you know, we'll see a bunch of different street photographers and how they work. Some set themselves up in places and they're waiting for those things. You know, this is sort of interesting to begin with. Now let's see how people interact with the space or what people are doing. Or, you know, Venice Beach is one, you know, obviously there's a lot of characters and things going on, but the really good photographs are the ones you don't expect from that, you know, not the cliche ones. Now, right now, what he's talking about is candid photography, which is almost that caught in the act. And you know, a lot of people like that type of photography, this sort of candid camera, like, ooh, I wasn't aware I was being photographed and it caught me doing this thing, you know. Those can be interesting. That is a definite way of approaching. Sometimes we'll talk about it as the God's eye perspective, you know, as if you're God and you're watching people who are unaware they're being watched, or the fly on the wall perspective where you're this thing that people aren't paying attention to. And sometimes cameras can function in that way. People get used to a camera being there. A lot of times when you introduce a camera, though, that's not what you're going to get. You're going to get people very aware of the camera. So we'll talk about that as we go on in street photo. And that's definitely what Cartier-Bresson was working on. When we look at Diane Arbus, though, Diane Arbus engaged the people she was photographing. They were aware they're being photographed. And we'll talk about what that difference is, especially given Diane Arbus's subject matter. So
This or not, if he gives the photographer his consent of being photographed, the only thing that matters is the absence of posing. To create a candid photo, you have numerous methods. You can photograph the subject in motion, or by avoiding prior preparation of the subject, or by surprising him, and very important, by not distract him during the process of taking photos. Bresson started with painting and drawing. He used to call a photo an immediate sketch that you can't correct it. If you try to correct it, then you make another photo. And correction is also impossible because that moment it's gone. You can't ask a person to repeat the gesture, so sometimes the photo can disappear. He didn't take documenting.
So this photo here, I really like this photo. One, you know, this guy here's the focal point. So, you know, again, we look at the rule of thirds. He's got his head down, sort of like this sadness, his hat off, you know, like he's in thought. I just loved the way these people were so perfectly lined up and spaced, you know, and it's not the time of the 6-foot pandemic, but there is sort of this personal space. I also like the way they almost look like they're rolling. Like this one seems flat on the back, side, forward, back to the side. You know, there's this sort of sense of movement. The one thing that I cannot stand in this photo, and I so don't know whether this was even possible, you know, especially with here, you have no options because you're shooting on film, it is the way it is this guy here being up with his finger up, sort of drawing attention away from this. If he were just laid out on his back, and even if her arm were down, it would almost feel like this field of dead people and him being very sad. To me, that would be in Photoshop. I can go in and I can get rid of him. I could even maybe take a few photographs where he's laying down and then drop him in laying down. So we'll talk about that. Now, which is the correct way? I don't know. That's going to be that is a discussion. Now that we can manipulate photos to be anything we want, what is appropriate and what is not? What makes for a good photograph and what doesn't? I'm sure we'll have some interesting discussions about that. But to me, if that guy weren't there or if he were laid out, perfect photograph.
Took photography seriously and he didn't like it. He also considered himself a bad journalist. He was a photographer that depended 100% on capturing the moment. He went to a place.
So like this image, what makes it is this kid here and then this kind of guy that looks like Jackie Gleason in this funky walk back here with this hat, all this going on. What kills this image for me is that right there. And again, if you had this on your digital camera, I would immediately just move that up, straighten these windows up. And again, the photograph would be so much better.
And when he saw a strong relation between shapes that was visually pleasant, he took the photo. In bresson photos, you'll notice the beauty of shapes and geometry. The structure of the photo is what matters and what brings joy to the photographer and the viewer. He called it intellectual pleasure, the geometry of what was in front of him. And sometimes it doesn't matter how much you look, because sometimes there is no picture. The action could be interesting, but if the relation between the subject and the shapes and geometry is not perfect, then you don't have a photo. And the difference between a good photo and a bad one is only millimeters. At one moment, Bresson was asked, "How do you make your pictures?" And his answer was, "I don't know. It's not."
So when I tell you to, photographing these kids would be interesting, but moving back and shooting them through this sort of, war-torn wall. Now, I realize you may not have a war-torn wall in you around you or what you're doing, but it's thinking about that environment, thinking what's that thing that I can do to make this more interesting.
Important. So we understand that photography for Bresson was an act of seeing, understanding, and feeling. The camera was just a means to create his instant drawing. The technical process was not important, but feeling when the decisive moment happened. You can't foresee it. You can try and predict it, but you have to be there and just act. You take a photo and you capture a whole world in it. It's all there for the viewer to see. There is no hiding. There is just the photo in front of you. Because he was so used to take candid photos, he said that the most difficult thing for him was taking a portrait. The reason is because the person knows what is going to happen and he poses. And when the person agrees to be photographed, then a simple snapshot becomes a portrait. He photographed a lot on the streets, but he also liked to photograph people in their environment, in their homes. Bresson said you have to be like a cat inside their homes. Just observe and notice. Capturing the essence, it's like putting the camera between someone's skin and his shirt. The process of being photographed leaves you naked in front of the photographer. The process was an intimate one, and that's what made it difficult. That's also the reason for searching for those candid moments. People get embarrassed in front of the camera, but when they don't know you are there, they're so natural. Another person asked how many photos you take, because they were thinking you have to take lots of photos to capture one of these moments. The answer was again, there is no rule. And again, we're taking back to the essence. Photography is an artistic act. It's a reaction to what's in front of you. You see it happening and you click. Bresson said, "I never think, I act." If we follow his advice, then you have to be yourself, but also forget about yourself. Ideas are dangerous. You don't have to think because you'll try to change it. Photograph as it is and let it cut you. Sometimes you just sit there and wait. The moments are seen by you and you decide what and when to photograph depending on your state of mind. And here I found something that Bresson said that is very similar to something that Ansel Adams said, a photographer with a completely different range of subjects. The person you are, the love, the faith, they're all there in your photos. The way you feel, the books you read, the music you listen to, it will influence the way you see the world. Moments will lose importance or gain status in your eyes depending on your state of mind. A photographer is not lucky, and you can't rely on luck. With this being said, you have to photograph a lot. As Bresson said, you have to milk the cow a lot to get a little cheese. Constant work is important and it's decisive, like the moment you're after. He had a philosophical approach to photography and to life. Every moment and second that went away was a slice of death that was happening around him. But he was not celebrating death. He just was aware of and also knew that every moment was a new one, alive and vibrant. And that was what he was after before that moment vanished in the waves of time. Bresson believed that you can find interesting things to photograph everywhere, but everything is interesting if you scratch it. Everyone made 10 good photos in his life, was one of Bresson's quotes. The consistency of good work is what's more important. Perhaps one of the reasons he liked taking these candid photos was because the love and hate relation with the people. He said that he loved people and then he hated people. And sometimes the camera becomes a weapon and can be used as propaganda. An interesting thing was that while he was looking for that decisive moment, he didn't have photos made by him on the walls of his house. He said he just liked taking photos. It was like the moments were there, he came and photographed them, and then he abandoned the moment and the photo in that place and time. A final thought before I leave you is this short quote that a camera can be a warm kiss, a sketchbook, a machine gun. Hope you enjoyed this photography essay and the decisive moment of Henri Cartier-Bresson. Leave a comment below and tell me on what other...
Okay, so that's about Cartier-Bresson. And again, the decisive moment, that idea that you bring things to the photos, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about Cartier-Bresson. Again, if you want to read a little bit more about him, here it is. I'm not going to go through all of that, especially not today. I'm going to try now to go back. I just want to get Diane Arbus in before we leave, and we'll talk more about it next week. Again, a shorter thing on Diane Arbus. Her photographs are going to be much more controversial. There is a lot more information I want to talk about when it comes to Diane Arbus.
In 1923, Deanne Numeroff was born into a wealthy lifestyle as a daughter of a department store owner in the city of Manhattan. She always hated being rich, saying, "The family fortune always seemed to me humiliating." At the age of 13, Deanne had already met future husband Alan Arbus, who would soon introduce her to her first camera. She married in 1942. To make a living, her and her husband Alan became fashion photographers together, working at the family-owned department store. Deanne came up with the ideas and Alan did the rest, which included taking the photographs and developing them. 10 years later, and after having 2 kids, Deanne finally admitted to the dissatisfaction that she felt with her fashion photography career. Her first interest in photographing the forbidden, as others like to call it, came in 1957 when the circus came to town. Soon after her first encounter with these misunderstood subjects, Arbus became obsessed with photographing the unknown. Unfortunately, as Deanne became more involved in candid portraiture, Alan was still working in the fashion photography business. The couple separated in 1969. This split allowed Deanne to step out on her own, and ultimately it was the factor that allowed her to become an actual photographer. As her work became more independent, she chose subjects that provoked controversy. Arbus is known today to be the photographer of freaks. This includes homosexuals, cripples, sick, dying, transvestites, dwarves, nudists, and many more. Some of her most well-known photographs.
So she says that sort of offhandedly, and Diane Arbus referred to them as the freaks. But what I want you to understand is the way she photographs them, and I'm going to come back and we're going to see a lot more Diane Arbus images, is not an exploitive way. It's not like they're the sideshow carnival freaks, like, oh, look how weird these people are. There's a tremendous amount of empathy. And we'll talk about that because she almost photographs them in a way that you have to understand how society was very oppressive at that time, you know, in the 1950s. And again, I'll come back and I'll talk about it. But, you know, hold off on that judgment about calling them freaks, because I want to spend some time talking about that next class.
Identical twins, child with toy hand grenade, and transvestite on a couch. That special something that separated Deanne from most photographers that also captured the subject matter was she became more emotionally involved with her subject. She would talk to them and help them get more comfortable with her. There was a specific instance where she was capturing a nudist camp where she agreed to be naked herself in order to gain her subject's trust. In the last 2 years of her life, she worked on her very well-known Untitled series. The series of photographs was taken in multiple institutions for the mentally challenged. She became very involved with this series, devoting many pages in her notebook to describe her retarded subjects. Many of her late photographs were similar to when she first started photography. She would take candid shots of people on the street, but now she had matured as an artist compared to when she had started. Because of the years of practice, she was now able to capture a feeling in her photographs that she originally wasn't able to get. Towards the end of her life, Deanne would fall into depressed moods when she was really struggling to find out what the meaning of her life was. She talked about her emotions, saying, "I go up and down a lot." She wrote this to her friend in 1968. Maybe I've always been like that. Partly what happens, though, is I get filled with energy and joy, and I begin lots of things, or I think about what I want to do and get all breathless and excitement. And quite suddenly, either through tiredness or disappointment or something more mysterious, the energy vanishes, leaving me harassed, swamped, distraught, frightened by the very things I thought were so eager for. In July of 1971, Deanne committed suicide at the age of 48 by climbing into her bathtub, overdosing on pills and slitting her wrists. After her death, her daughter June became the curator of her mother's estate. She was in charge of releasing any of the 7,500 rolls of film that Deanne never got around to developing. It also includes any other books or journals that Arbus wrote in. The full estate is now owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Even though, during her life, her work was seen as controversial and risque, she's the person who set the boundaries for future photographers for what is seen as acceptable or not. She made the forbidden known to the world. Her different way of looking at her subjects may have been misunderstood, but her photography will never be forgotten.
Okay, before I finish up here, the thing that I want you to understand about the Diane Arbus photographs is that last part where she says that, you know, I forget exactly how she said it, but basically what Diane Arbus is important for is She expanded the range of what became acceptable as a photograph. So by photographing people that didn't fit into what we normally consider acceptable subject matter, she opened that door up for the next generation, the next generation of artists to investigate subject matter that might be considered controversial or not suitable for a photograph. She pushed that envelope. And whether you like the work or not, and we'll talk about all those things, what's important to understand that as an art maker, as somebody in the history of photo, she's extremely important for that thing. And we'll talk about what makes artists important or their work important or valuable as we move on and all of that kind of stuff. But keep in mind, she expanded the range of what was acceptable in a photograph, and that opens up all kinds of stuff. So